Welcome to Talking Absolute Worship. I have plucked three feathers of the brightest feathers from the parrot of exegesis, and I have them alongside me, Neil and Tim and Rachel, who have all done some reading and some thinking about some really quite challenging texts this week. And that's the reason we're going to start with Neil. Neil, where should we where should we even begin with solid and quite tricky texts like these?
Well, as we've often said, I think one of the big decisions for the preacher this week is, what am I not going to try and cover? Because as I was reading these, I thought with the first one, I thought, oh, there's a lot in there. And then by the time I got to Mark, I thought, okay, so we've got kind of an entire year's worth of stuff in one Sunday. So I think for me, the big decision was to try and work out a way in. And the bit that struck me, I went to Mark, and I'm struck by the way that Jesus responds to James and John. And you could do a lot of things with that text, but the thing that I was particularly struck by, and that some of the commentaries helped me to sort of dwell on, was that the way Jesus answers James and John as they kind of bounce up to him and say, hey, Jesus, remember us? We'd like to be, in the top positions, and don't worry about the others. And what Jesus gives by way of an answer is an interesting reflection on things at the heart of the life of the church, because he says, can you be baptized with the baptism that I've got? Can you share in the communion that I am sharing in? Can you drink the cup? And can you also cope with the fact that I am heading to the cross? Because this little bit of Mark comes after, for the third time, Jesus has said, oh, and by the way, everybody, this is going to take us to the cross. So I think that might be an interesting way in, because I think with these texts, I was struck that they are so enormous in terms of the amount of theology and doctrine that you could go to, that I found myself trying to work out for a congregation like the ones that I'll be preaching in. How do we find a way in? And there is something wonderfully familiar about baptism, about sharing the cup, about reflecting on the cross, that I think then what these passages then invite us to do is to really dwell on those, and also begin to then recognize in their very familiarity, there is a wealth of meaning that perhaps we're so familiar with them that some of the deep significance of them just washes over us. So you could then, I think, in a sermon, and I think I might play around with this, is you could actually then take either what does it mean to be baptized with the baptism that Jesus has, or what does it mean to drink the cup, or what does it mean to travel with him to the cross? And any one of those three would take you on a journey into these other texts. If you wanted it to be a sermon in which you unpacked some of the doctrine of the atonement, because that's pretty heavily where we are, then you could. But I think what Jesus gives us in that answer is a way, he gives us pictures, because that's what he so often does. And indeed, Hebrews is giving us pictures. Hebrews is giving us this picture of the high priest and the worship tradition. So I think I might want to take the picture of baptism and what does it really mean? I remember it was William Willimon published a little book called Preaching to the Baptized, and the wonderful opening lines of that book are that he says, when you stand up to preach in church, you're probably preaching to a bunch of people, some of whom have been baptized, some of whom haven't been baptized and wonder whether they should have been, some of whom might be thinking about baptism, and some of them have no idea what you're talking about. And the crucial thing to understand is that none of us know what it means, because we all have to spend the rest of our lives working out what does it mean to have been baptized, or to be about to be baptized, or whatever. So I think that would be the sort of direction I'd go. I'm not sure how heavily I would go into the doctrinal atonement stuff, because I think just sitting and listening to that might start to feel like it was a lecture on doctrine rather than a sermon.
Tim?
Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting, because I often think that when I do a baptism, and having just come out of lockdown, I had a number have been delayed. So I think I've done 3 in the last 3 weeks. I think that's the time I get the opportunity to speak to folk about what it is, or what I feel it is, but also importantly what I feel it isn't. You know, that it's not superstitious, that it's not a get out of jail free card. And the fact that you get kind of non-church folk primarily at these things, I seem to anyway. I'm fascinated by the fact that there is still something that they are drawn to baptism. And I always ask the parents when I go, either singularly or plural, why they want the child baptized. And I always say to them beforehand, this is not a test. You know, you don't have to pass this test. I'm going to baptize your child. But why do you want it? And some don't know. And that's absolutely fine. The fact that they do, there is something extraordinarily powerful about folks out there who have little church history themselves, and yet still feel drawn to be part of this. And I think it's one of the last great opportunities we have for sort of outreach almost.
Oh, Rachel.
Yeah, I was just reminded of a couple of weeks ago, I had an email from somebody living in Spain, but who has a sort of tenuous connection with one of my churches. And she was asking about being baptized as an adult. And she said, oh, I was christened as a baby. So obviously, you know, there's a whole conversation to be had about, you know, second baptism and blah, blah, blah. And the fact that certainly in the Methodist Church, we don't do that. But what we could, you know, how we could do something that might satisfy what she's asking for, but she's in Spain, so she's going to have to find someone, blah, blah, blah. So I'd gone through all of that, and I tried to be very kind of open about it. And then I had a strong email from her son, who was saying that, you know, she hasn't been baptized before. She was christened, and that's not the same thing. So I haven't yet responded to say, I'm sorry, there's no, you know, sacrament of christening. What happened as a baby, you know, was baptism. And, you know, urging me to write back to his mother and tell her that she really must be baptized because her eternal salvation is at stake.
Oh, wow.
So I haven't responded to him yet. But it just, you know, there's so much, like you say, so much caught up in what is it all about? And, you know, do people, I never say christening. I never say christening when I talk to people. And yet there's still this idea that that's somehow different from real baptism. So I think that it's really, yeah, a good opportunity to explore some of that.
Yeah, and I like the idea that Neil talked about. Say, you know, you are baptized, but you spend your life working out what that means, kind of idea. And I think that's kind of reflected, and it's not the case for all baptism liturgies. And I'm trying to remember exactly which is the one I've been using most recently, but I'm fairly sure that the one I'm using or have been using, the promises come after the baptism. And you baptize usually a baby. You baptize the baby, and then you ask promises. It's not it's a bit like Tim saying, "Yeah, I'm going to do it." So now let's talk about what it means. So don't stress. I'm going to do it. But the promises are something that you work out afterwards for the whole of your life. It's not a condition of entry. But I was also interested when Neil said you could do a sermon on taking the cup, or you could do a sermon on being baptized, or you could do a sermon on following the way of the cross. I was kind of wondering if you meant those would end up being different sermons, Neil, or whether they're just all pictures of the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly you could go either way, couldn't you? They all are woven together, and part of the power of the Mark text is that when James and John and the other disciples are trying to pin down what does it mean to follow Jesus, and they're getting caught up in kind of a very worldly, it's about power or status or rank or authority or whatever. Jesus subverts that with this series of images. So yeah, you could put them all together. But I guess, even that would be quite a lot. I mean, it might be interesting, and I mean, we'll come on to this, won't we? In terms of the whole arc of the service, you could say, well, if I was to take one element of that in the sermon, for example, the baptismal dimension, we could, I mean, if, for example, it was a communion service, then you would have a beautiful way in to pick up another thread of it as you actually gathered around the table. And in the choice of the music and the hymns and the prayers, you could be exploring what it means to follow the way of the cross. So you could almost allow the whole service to be a reflection on it. Yeah, I mean, I guess, I mean, we often touch on this in these recordings, don't we? That part of the challenge for the preacher is how do you avoid trying to cover so much ground that you actually skate over everything?
Yeah.
That's I guess what was in my mind.
Yeah, and there's you mentioned atonement and whether it became a lecture, and I suppose I'm still wrestling in my head with it. There is a sermon in Mark that I want to preach about about atonement and what it means. But I'm really not sure that I've got the tools or the brevity or the language or whatever to do it. The sermon I want to preach really is, and it's kind of an act. And I don't want to diss the lectionary, but the selection of the readings is done for a purpose, isn't it? And in the thread that we're following, they're supposed, the Old Testament reading is supposed to be a supportive reading, isn't it, or a linked reading of some way to the gospel. And there is an agenda in the linking of Isaiah 53 and Mark, which I don't think is there in Mark. And I think preaching Isaiah 53 and Mark together, you're in real danger of putting together two things that aren't the same thing, but that look like they might be the same thing. Because there's a sermon in Mark that I'd want to preach. The whole context for this is about power and dominance and lording it over people. And he extends that from just a petty dispute amongst his disciples to the whole empire system that he's living in. That's the context. The context isn't, can my sins be forgiven, or any of that stuff. The context is what would a different world look like? And there's a kind of a sermon in here that's saying we're being set free from that world to live in a different world, the kingdom of God world, and that looks very different. And what would that look like? And that's what this is about. But because at the end it's got that word ransom, and that's taken to mean one thing when quite possibly it means something else. But again, you're ending up into an intellectual lecture rather than a sermon, aren't you? Then it's really quite difficult to do that without going off on one. See what you mean? So I quite like your approach, I think, and I think some I don't know. I often have the picture in my head of a gallery I went to in Florence, where they had a whole gallery of unfinished statues, and it is really quite moving somehow, to see half figures emerging from the rock, but never finished, or perhaps they chipped a finger off and said, "Oh, sod it, I'm going to start again." But but it was just half figures coming out of the rock, and it was really quite. I just spent a lot of time in that room, and sometimes I think that's what my sermon preparation is about. Sometimes I'm going to have to leave that half emerging from the rock and go and do another one that's actually going to work on Sunday, and not try and take one that's not. It's just not going to fully emerge. But I kind of felt that about all of these passages, which was really frustrating. So I think your approach is quite helpful there. Tim, where were you thinking of going?
I sort of started somewhere else. So I looked at Isaiah, and I also looked at one of the alternate psalm choices, at Psalm 104. And that was talking about this kind of classic image of the skies being like a tent, and the beams that hold it up go deep down into the water, and that then you've got the power of the water underneath, and you've got the wind and the sun, and everything else lives underneath this canopy and moves at the will of God. And there's a kind of implication there that it's benign unless God wishes it otherwise, which was sort of interesting. And the earth kind of emerges from a sort of watery chaos, but has unshakable foundations. And I mean, I'll come back to that. And then I looked at Isaiah, which is, part of the servant song. So you've got all that stuff about who the servant is and what the servant is, and does it relate to the other servant songs. And I was reading about this idea of the servant being Israel. In some songs it's a kind of collective thing, and in this one it's there is that more sense of the individual. But I was reading a commentary which said that that can still be understood as meaning sort of Israel. And I was wondering about going, it talks about God vindicating and exalting the servant, the suffering servant. So you've got a number of ideas. You've got that atonement thing. You've got the servant living and dying for others. And not only is the servant sort of vindicated, but his suffering is on behalf of the transgressions of us all. So you've got that kind of classic atonement view there. But I was thinking more of it in terms of, what does that say about Israel? And I was trying to think about it in terms of today. And one of my colleagues has been waiting to go out to Israel as part of this, the humanitarian monitoring scheme that they do. It's been delayed 2 or 3 times now because of COVID. And I was thinking about that response, really. If Israel itself has been vindicated, and if we want to bring in a bit of this, I mean, danger using bits, I know, but if you bring in that idea of the power of weakness, turning things on its head. So it's not only about the strong, it's about the first shall be last and all that stuff. How do we hold? Why does Israel respond in the way it does? If Israel itself has been vindicated, then why do they feel that need to display things through strength? Why it seems to be a huge lack of, I know this is a bit simplistic, but a huge lack of compassion in their relationships with Palestinians. And I think there's been so much about that recently, and I've been following during lockdown the series of webinars on the Balfour Project, and a number of lectures that have come across from politicians, theologians, all sorts coming out of that region. And I've become more and more intrigued as to why a nation that is now established in power cannot have compassion, and where does that come from? So the risk of, no, not at the risk of, I don't mind being political, small p in things. I think that's kind of really worth exploring. If Israel is a suffering servant that has been vindicated by God, why why do they now feel the need to dominate in the way that they do, seemingly without compassion? All the stories that come out about deliberately putting in policies which means that the Palestinians cannot tend their crops, cannot get access to their crops, and therefore the Palestinians say, you've not looked after them, we can legitimately claim that land for ourselves. And I know it's hugely complicated stuff, but I think sometimes it's worth looking at these ancient words and seeing how that relates today. So that was kind of one side of things, but that also plays in, I think, to the whole climate change idea about our responsibility to creation. And there was a study recently by the University of Bath. They were interviewing younger people, so under 25s, about the future, and there was an awful lot of despondency about the future of humanity, and a number of them saying they didn't feel they could bring children into this world, knowing what their future might be with climate change. And I think these texts also have something to say about that, about our responsibility. What would our churches like? What would our churches look like if we really made that the heart of our mission? To really take seriously the call to creation, I suppose. So there's kind of a number of different things going on in there. But I think, I don't know. So I don't know exactly. You can't preach on all of that. I'm not quite sure exactly where I pick out of that. But those are the kind of ideas that I had. I think I probably would leave the atonement. It's plenty of other opportunities to explore that if we wish. But as you said, Phil, I'm not sure it's entirely legitimate to read that Isaiah. It's not direct prophecy. It's about something else, and we've kind of shoehorned it into things. So yeah, that's kind of where I go with it, I think.
Yeah. I found myself spending quite a bit of time thinking around the idea of the suffering servant, and I think fairly widespread now understanding of the suffering servant as being the people of Israel, and their suffering being about exile and all of the things that have happened. And in my head, I think I went in a slightly different direction. In my head, then that makes quite a lot of sense. About a lot of the stuff about their suffering being actually being redeemed in the end, leading to something in the end, and not being wasted, and perhaps says something about where we are as a world at the moment. Having, we say, well, we've gone through the trauma of COVID. Does it mean anything? All of that, what does it mean? What I think what's happening in this suffering servant stuff is Isaiah trying to help a people understand their suffering and find some meaning in it. And it's as dangerous a topic for Isaiah as it would be for us to try and talk to a congregation and tell them what the meaning in their suffering was. That's really difficult, isn't it? Because everybody's got a slightly different experience and whatever of suffering going on. So it's dangerous territory, but I think that's what's happening in Isaiah. I think he's trying to help a nation understand its trauma and try to find some meaning in it. And it is a bit messy around the edges when you do that for a whole nation. And it's maybe less easy now that we don't see ourselves in national terms the same way as perhaps the people of Israel did. We're a lot more individualistic in our understanding of the world. And so we don't see the nation going through things. So we say we do, and we maybe do on one level, but not. I'm sure nowhere near to the same extent do we do we perceive national trauma in the same way as we perceive individual trauma? So there might, yeah, I think there might be some mileage in dwelling a bit on that, on looking in Isaiah for how a nation is dealing with its trauma and its hopes, for redemption and for change, really, and that one day it will be different. Who's not saying that at the moment? Yeah, Neil.
I think you're onto something there. I think there would be some interesting connections if you think of sort of national trauma. I mean, we have had the global trauma of the pandemic, but I think, for example, of what Brexit did to us, and what the conversations around Brexit did to families and communities, and in a sense, we're kind of, that has been overwhelmed and washed over by the pandemic, because no sooner were we kind of thinking, oh Lord, Brexit, suddenly it was, oh goodness, and now there's a global pandemic, oh good, and I was also very struck, I mean, we've got friends in the United States, and they were, of course, having the anniversary of 9/11, and reflecting on that, and then the withdrawal from Afghanistan after 20 years of us being in Afghanistan, and so it goes on. I think there is something about, what Isaiah is doing with the suffering servant is speaking into the public square, and maybe one of the things that would be interesting in a sermon to reflect on is I mean, these are texts that it would be quite tempting, especially if, as we think about the doctrine of the atonement, for example, for it to become all about me. It's all about personal salvation. It's all about how am I put right with God. But actually, these are also texts that take us in a completely different direction, which is, what does it mean for the world to be saved, for community to be saved, for God to act? And what does it mean for us to reflect on some of the traumas and challenges? Climate change is another one, where we have a sense that there is something deeply unsettling and wrong going on. And where is God? And I mean, that's one of the classic questions, isn't it? Where is God? Well, these are texts that want to say some pretty powerful things about where God is when things are falling apart.
Yeah, it's a very different direction. So thank you, Tim. Rachel, I'm sure we've left you loads of space to talk about Melchizedek. And Hebrews high priesthood. Seriously, where were you thinking of going this week?
The question that struck me was in the gospel reading, and there were a few questions in there, I think, but the question, what do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked the disciples, and it just reminded me of my kids, because when they were little, they'd sort of say, I want you to say yes. And you'd sort of say, what? I can't promise I'm going to say yes. It depends on the question. And it's kind of like, the disciples are sort of back with James and John, we want you to do something for us, kind of thing. And I feel like you've got a mini crash course in being a disciple in this passage. And I always think it's quite interesting, because we read about the disciples with sort of two hats on, I think. Because half the time we're looking at the disciples and we're kind of cringing at some of the stuff that they say and do, and when they completely misunderstand, and we're sort of like, oh no, oh, there they go again, kind of thing. But at the same time, we see ourselves reflected in them, and that's not always a comfortable reflection. And so Jesus's response to their request is, as Neil's pointed out, is he confronts them with his cup and with his baptism, and asks them, can you take all that on? And they're really quick to say, oh yes, of course we can. No problem. That's it's kind of easy. And actually, both the cup and the baptism, they're both highly dangerous things, aren't they? They take us, through a path of death, before we venture into the new life that comes. And Jesus sort of is pointing out the dangers and the risks, I think, of being a disciple, that it's about death and life. It's not just about the new life that we can all rejoice in, but it's about death as well. And then I like the way that that Jesus sort of talks about leadership in essence. That leadership isn't, being a good leader is not about necessarily being, the most efficient person, or the person who gets things done most quickly, or the person who can, be very organized. It's not about running around responding to the whims of other people. That doesn't make you a good leader or a good disciple. But actually what makes you great is about faithfulness and being a follower of Jesus kind of fully, not conforming to expectations, but having the courage to be a different kind of person. So I think alongside Jesus's question of what do you want me to do for you, I think almost I'd like to add the possible question that's hanging there, what are you prepared to do for me? I think so. I might do a bit of exploration about how quickly do we think that we can dive into this this cup or this baptism? How glibly do we accept those things? But actually, are there things that we're not prepared to do? When we're the big fish at church, and have quite a lot of power, perhaps some people do. I just thought there'd be an interesting exploration into sort of discipleship and some of those implications.
Yeah, I very much resonate with that. And as I was, I think probably the word is wading through these texts, and I waded my way through Hebrews, and I got to Mark, and it was almost with a sense of relief that I clung hold of that little exchange, because suddenly we've got something ordinary and sort of human exchange going on in the middle of all this dense theology, and that question stands out. And of course, it stands out a little bit because. Spoiler alert, it's the same question that is asked next week in a slightly different context. Jesus asks exactly the same question and gets two very different answers. What do you want me to do for you? And I just think that is just a brilliant question for a congregation to be asked to reflect on. Maybe even just to say to the congregation, what is it you want Jesus for? What do you? Why are you even? What's the place of Jesus in your life? What do you want him to do for you? What are you expecting him to do? And it might be that people have never even asked themselves that question, and the answer's not easy, is it? Because we're used to having it the way around, as you said, Rachel. We're used to having it with the what do we have to do for Jesus? Why are we crowding around Jesus? What is it we're expecting of Jesus? Are we expecting eternal salvation? Are we expecting to be changed? Are we expecting to be dragged backwards through a hedge towards the cross? What do we want him? What do we want Jesus to do for? And it would be a fascinating question to ask people, wouldn't it? I think what answers you'd get. And, so yeah, I reckon that would be a really powerful opening for a congregation. I think that's like loads of directions to go in. I'm struggling with Hebrews, to be honest. I'm kind of glad that nobody else has gone off on that in a big way, because Hebrews appears to be talking to an audience who understand his underlying metaphor. The whole high priest talk is something that they would instantly resonate with. But it strikes me with the congregation, if you've got to explain that first and then say, well, this is a bit like that, you might as well have not explained that first bit. You might as well reach for an analogy that they would actually understand to start with, rather than explain one and then say, well, this is a bit like that. It seems like a kind of a step beyond what a congregation can helpfully hear. I don't really know what to do with passages like that. when the context in which they're writing is now so different to the one we are, that the thing they're referring to, the analogy, just doesn't work, and you have to explain it all first. Yeah, Rachel.
Yeah, I was thinking that if I felt that I had to bring in a second reading and not just have the gospel, you know, I wouldn't want Isaiah, because as we've already said, I don't feel that fits. That feels like a kind of manufactured fit, if you like. And the best I could come up with was that I felt that Hebrews showed that our ability to deal with the needs of others only comes through vulnerability and weakness, and not through strength. I mean, that was as much as I felt I could really do, without then having to go into the whole what's it all about stuff.
Yeah, but obviously, listening preachers, feel free, knock yourself out with Melchizedek. That's also perfectly fine alongside the other approaches that we've suggested. Neil suggested that there are other things to do in worship other than preaching earlier on. So we've all had a little bit of a look to see how we might flesh out these ideas with other things other than the preacher's marvelous words. So what have you come up with, Neil?
Well, I mean, I do think that one way of doing it would be to interleave, you know, particularly that Mark reading all the way through the service. So that's one thought. But I think there is another thread that cropped up in these readings, and it was the thread of security. You know, where does our security lie? What makes us feel safe? How and where are we held? And I just started. I mean, this isn't going to be rocket science, but you know, you can just have some fun by playing around with what happens when you just type into a search engine. Of course, many search engines are available. That, you know, if you type in words like security, what do you get? And you get, you know, you could play around with this a lot in terms of images in the church, in terms of if you're into, as some of us are, you know, making things out of enormous cardboard boxes. You could have an enormous padlock and key. You might want to dress your elders up in stab vests and demonstrate demonstrate that, you know, I mean, obviously some of this could be taken a little far, but what's interesting, you know, maybe is to, because I do think that one of the things that, I mean, you've touched on, Phil, you know, not least with the Hebrews, is how do we let these texts come to life for our congregations? And I do think that, you know, one of the things that's going on, not least with James and John, perhaps in their question, one of the commentaries that I was reading was just suggesting, you know, it's very easy to read this as, you know, James and John just want power. But another way of reading it is that actually James and John have heard Jesus say, I am going to the cross, I am going to die, and they're scared. And what they want is safety. They want security. And they think the best place to get it is by being given the best places in the kingdom. Because maybe that'll be like an army of angels will be their stab vest. And I just thought, you know, you could, with some images, quite quickly help a worship space become a space for reflecting upon where do we look to for sanctuary and security today, which would then open up, you know, your question that is Jesus's question. What do you want me to do for you? And that might be, you know, that might lend itself in prayers, and it might lend itself in actually also something that people could take away, because maybe what you do is you have a whole stack of images of padlocks and keys and chains and shut doors, and you just invite a congregation to take those away after the service and maybe put them on their fridge with a magnet, and just think through the week, where do I instinctively look for safety, and what does it mean to actually say my safety is in God?
Yeah. I must do a survey of this, but I think were I to add up the number of things that Neil has suggested I stick on my fridge with a magnet, I think I'm going to need some more fridges. But that might
It's
well
a
fit
great
in with
place.
that might well fit in a little bit with what Tim is saying about Israel and the
Yeah.
whole question, because I think one of the psychological things that is going on in Israel is this question of security and feeling secure, and where do I put our security, hence fences
Yeah.
and weaponry, and the UK, we have just this morning at the time of recording trumpeting a new pact with Australia and New Zealand and America, or is it just the three?
Australia and America.
Australia, so New Zealand not included, where our security is basically a nuclear-powered submarine. So that's the focus of it today. That's where our security is, and we need long-range nuclear-powered submarines that can't be detected in order to confront our fears about China. So it's not as if we're immune from this as a nation. So yeah, I think that could go in all sorts of different directions. Tim, what did you find?
Before I say that, I just had a thought from what Neil said. You could have a church outing to one of those escape rooms.
I thought the church was an escape room.
You could make it particularly difficult for certain people in the church. I'll say that. Okay, so I found a lovely poem by G.K. Chesterton called "It Is Something to Have Been," which there is also a hymn version in the Unitarian hymn book, Hymns for Living, but the poem is longer and speaks of what it is to have one line, to have known the things that from the weak are furled, perilous ancient passions, strange and high. It is something to be wiser than the world. It is something to be older than the sky. And there's a whole series of stanzas about what it is to have been, about all those things that you have seen and witnessed in, and by extrapolation, what we do with that. And it was, I found that very moving. And the other sort of interesting thing I found was that I read somewhere, and I can't remember where it was now, that Psalm 104, which I chose, has echoes of a hymn that Akhenaten wrote to the sun god Aten, and Akhenaten, of course, was the one who was credited with bringing the idea of monotheism to the world. He told the folks, he wrote this hymn to the sun god Aten and told the folks of Egypt that they, from now on, they would just worship this one god, not their whole phalanx of deities. And that was fascinating, because it kind of eventually led to his downfall, and he was sort of written out of history. But he was a fascinating character, and there's something about was it a case of both cultures having similar thoughts and arriving at these ideas about aspects of creation at a similar time. And there's a wonderful opera by Philip Glass on about Akhenaten, and that I found this. This just might be kind of a bit of fun to. Where do I get share from? Oh, there we are, share screen. And that's not what I want.
You want the audio as well. Don't forget the audio if it's an opera.
Where do I do that? Remind me where I share sound.
Yeah, that's the fella.
But that's not there. So why isn't that one? Okay. That seems to have disappeared. which is unfortunate. I always seem to have these problems with this stuff, don't I? Anyway, if you YouTube, put Philip Glass Martin in, and there's kind of some wonderful images that come up, and that just might be kind of interesting to play around with those ideas. And just some other interesting, another idea was really to, if we're thinking of the suffering servant, you could kind of brainstorm with folks, who are the suffering servants today? And you could kind of start with that. And that might be interesting, again, coming out of the pandemic, about our views on who those, what that figure represents. And that might be something locally within our own communities that we're aware of, but it might become more nationally or even globally. And I thought that might be a kind of an interesting sort of brainstorm to do with, to play around with those ideas. And other than that, really just a couple of hymns. I've been using quite a lot lately of this Hymns for Living, which is the Unitarian hymn book. There's a couple of very good hymns in there. And of course, the good old Fred Kahn hymn, For Ourselves No Longer Living. So that was somewhere where I was going with that. And you can edit this next bit out if you will, Phil. But I think I was drawn to the Akhenaten thing because when the opera was first produced in this country back in the mid 1980s, I was actually in it. So there we are.
Ah, well, I will Google Tim Richards.
Probably
See if I
won't
can
come up.
find a grainy Super 8 converted video of it.
I've got them.
There we go. Rachel, where were you going? What did you find?
Well, I thought some sort of time for reflection around the question would be useful. You already sort of mentioned it, Phil. You know, what do we want from Jesus? You know, there we are on Sunday morning, sitting there. What do we want Jesus to do for us? Because I think it's quite interesting that sometimes, you know, he asks people, do you want to be well? And you know, sometimes you sort of think the answer might not be yes. So you know, I think it would be quite interesting to spend a bit of time in sort of personal reflection on that. And I thought maybe similarly, maybe get people to think about the kind of things that they love doing for the Lord, and to actually acknowledge that those things give joy, but also maybe get people to think, you know, have you got a red line? Is there something that you know would be a step too far? I'm going into stationing imminently, and my husband Graham, because we've no restrictions on geography, we can go anywhere because our daughter will have finished school, and so I've said, you know, it's about the post, it's not about where we are. And then every now and then, you know, he says, yeah, you know, that's what he feels as well. But then he'll say, yeah, but what if it was in Yorkshire? and I always have to say, it's not about the place. It's, you know, it's almost like for Graham, the red line might be Yorkshire.
We apologise to listeners from Yorkshire. Yeah.
So what might be just a bit too far for us to go in our walk with Jesus is, do we have sort of no-go areas? I thought that might be interesting to think about as well. And I came across a song. It's by Graham Kendrick, but I didn't know it. I don't know, it's probably about 10 years old or possibly a bit more. I will attempt to share it if I can. It might be this.
We're all getting rusty with this now. We're coming out.
We are. I know.
We're getting rusty with the old Zoom skills.
No, it's not that at all. So I'm going to stop sharing because I don't know where that's gone.
Yeah,
I've lost that too. So forget that. But it was a song called "Love Each Other," and it's kind of set in the upper room with Jesus washing the disciples' feet, and then and it's about. And then the second verse kind of reflects on our calling to be the washers of feet as well. So Love Each Other by Graham Kendrick. That's
look it up along with Akhenaten. Okay. Yeah. It's not dissimilar to what Neil was saying. Some of the sort of physical ideas I had. One idea I had was this whole idea of taking the cup, um, and I was struck as I think as you said, Rachel, how easily they said, "Yeah, we can do that." And so I think what I wouldn't want to do is invite the congregation to come out and say, "Would you take the cup?" and then invite them to take a cup. But what I wondered was whether we might have a cup, a chalice, because I'm kind of thinking the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus says this. Will you, are you willing to take this cup? Not even I was even reluctant. Never mind you. I was reluctant, and I begged for it to be taken away from me. And I kind of wondered about the sort of physicality of getting members to come out and actually take the cup and not say, "Yeah, I'll take it." That's not the gesture. The gesture would be just feeling the weight of it and reflecting on what it actually means to take the cup in your hand and then to reflect on that question. So some form of words that would help them think that through. Obviously, you'd have to come up with your own COVID restrictions for people handling the same cup, but that goes without saying. And then I thought similarly with renewal of baptism vows. I thought if we went down Neil's baptism route, whether there's some way of inviting the congregation into renewing baptism vows. And it's not normally part of URC or Methodist tradition, I don't think, but Anglicans, if you talk to your local Anglican vicar, some of them have got those special tools that you can sprinkle a whole congregation with. So you don't have to make do with a water bottle with holes in. They've got like posh, there's a name for them, isn't there?
It's like a pastry brush, isn't it?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, and some of them have got like silver sticks with holes in. It's quite cool. But they might have them, and they might let you borrow it to sprinkle the congregation and talk about not rebaptism, renewing your baptism vows somehow. I don't know whether that might fit in as a sort of physical thing to do with the congregation. And I always try and crowbar a bit of Bob Dylan in, and here we are. That's the wrong thing. Bob Dylan's got a song called, funnily enough, "What Can I Do For You?" He's asking it the other way around. He's reflecting on what Jesus has done for him and then asking, "What can I do for you?" So I'll just play the first verse and I'll scroll down to the lyrics so people can see. Everything to me, what can I do for you? Given me eyes to see, what can I do for you? Pulled me out of bondage, made me renewed inside, full of a hunger that had always been denied. Opened a door no man could shut, and opened it so wide.
You have given everything to me. What can I do for you? You can
look that up for yourself, but I just kind of quite liked the verse when he's trying to describe what Jesus has done for him. So how would he answer the question, "What can I do for you?" If Jesus was asking it? It's, "I'd like you to pull me out of bondage, renew me inside, fill up the hunger that's always been denied, open up a door no man can shut, and open it wide, and choose me to be among the few." I thought it was just, wow. I thought, this isn't a theologian. This is Bob Dylan. But he's answering that question in quite a powerful way of what Jesus can do for us. And of course, his response is, "What can I do for you?" given all that. The other thing is entirely unconnected to anything any of us have said at all. And that's the Psalm 91, which is the one that's set, or one of the ones that's set, has these words about being borne up, or God being our refuge, and on their hands they will bear you up so you won't dash your foot against a stone. Well, those words are reflected in this well-known song, "On Eagle's Wings," that will include into your hymns. People quite like this. Don't have to have pictures of eagles. Sure people recognise that. Yep. And that involves those words from Psalm 91. So that's a musical possibility. That's all I could come up with. But I have used the cup thing once before, many years ago at a youth conference, getting people to come out and just hold the cup, and it can be quite a powerful moment for people just to hold it and consider the weight of it. So, are there any other ideas that has sprung to mind and you need to get in before we go? Nope. No fancy ideas about Melchizedek to finish us off with. No, Neil.
Well, just I mean, this is trespassing, I know, into Rachel's territory, but I mean, there is that wonderful stuff, isn't there, in the Methodist Covenant service that you do, that and that I've been very blessed to share in, which I know has it has its own story, and it fits liturgically at a certain time of the year often. But some of those lines about "put me to doing," and so on, would resonate pretty powerfully with some of the stuff, and so that might just be another resource to think about.
Yeah, Rachel.
I'm sure that on one of our earlier recordings, Ruth did a whole load of stuff about Melchizedek.
She did, yeah.
And that was really good, and I can't remember any of it. But
if listeners look up the reverse lectionary, you can look up, find out, or look up on YouTube where Melchizedek appears, because it's only about twice. Then you can find that passage in the lectionary, work out which proper Sunday it was on, and then look it up. And at the beginning, Ruth says something really interesting about Melchizedek. So there you are. That's your homework. It's a guy that Abraham meets, isn't it? And he's both a king and a priest, and Abraham gives him much respect, or something. And yeah. Anyway, Ruth had something really good to say. That was really useful. So yeah, look that up in a previous recording. Thank you, Rachel. Yeah. Okay, so this is a task, and it's a considerable task, as it is every week, to bring this word to your congregations, to dedicate us all to this task as the days pass and Sunday approaches. Tim's going to pray with us.
Lord, we once more apply ourselves to the task of bringing these ancient words to life. And as we look at them, as we study them, and as we think of the world around us, help us to have direction and discernment. We've been aware of the choices that are possible in looking at these readings and the challenges that are in them. But that is always both the joy and sometimes the real anxiety when we open these texts. But help us to honestly look at what they have to say and how they can still speak powerfully into our congregations, into our localities, and into our world today. So be with everyone who is faced with the task of preaching on these texts, Lord, and guide them in the way that they should go. Amen.
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 Amen.